fertilizer emissions, not use. And this doesn't appear to be a typo or an error because people have been asking the minister about this. And this does seem to be a accurate depiction of what the government wants. Do you think the government's actually expecting farmers to reduce fertilizer use by 30% by 2030?
Well, yes, I do, because the first way they were measuring it didn't give them anything they could cheer about. Farmers are already stewards of the environment and their land. Of course, the four R's come into play: the right type, the right place, the right time, and the right amount. And that gives farmers the best results. Fertilizer is an expensive commodity. You just don't go out there and spread on hundreds of pounds that you don't need. A lot of times you'll wait till the crop is up, and then you'll top dress at certain areas to give that little zing to it. But it's now about micronutrients too, the copper and manganese and sulfurs and so on that drive the protein level up, the sulfur. And that's what farmers are gravitating towards. So for some reason, this government has got agriculture under its lens, not unlike what they've done to other resource sectors. And if they would stop and realize that this is all part of a supply chain, that when they make these types of changes to the base, the agricultural growers themselves, it affects the full supply chain, which ends up on the grocery store shelves. And that's where our high prices are coming from in these arcane regulations that they plan on bringing in to hit a target that doesn't matter. They've got a solution looking for a problem.
Well, it concerns me when they went from emissions to use. But what really concerns me is the idea that they keep saying this is going to be voluntary participation by farmers. I find that difficult to believe
Yeah.
because nothing during our COVID experience, during that whole pandemic, nothing was voluntary. It was mandated. They forced us to wear masks. They forced us to take the vaccine if we wanted to work or travel or to live like ordinary human beings. And the the environment and climate change minister, Stephen Guilbeault, who seems to be really in control of the ag department these days,
Mm-hmm.
he has gone around saying if we want to divorce ourselves from fossil fuels, I'm just going to turn off the pumps. I'm going to shut off the natural gas. I'm going to turn off the electricity. And I don't care if people are freezing or can't read or can't do anything normal because it's all about fulfilling the agenda of climate change.
Yeah.
And do you really believe for a minute that farmers are going to be this is going to be a voluntary program for farmers?
No, not at all. I think the same as we had a voluntary gun registry, after a while it became mandatory under these liberals. And that's what they do best. I mean, Trudeau with his little buddy Jagmeet Singh, who's also a closet anti-agricultural, from downtown Toronto. He doesn't understand where the bread on his table comes from and how it gets there and why it costs what it costs. And that's the problem with these guys. They're disconnected from any type of rural roots. They've had a couple of ag ministers. Lawrence MacAulay actually did run a dairy at one point, not a large one by any stretch, but he actually was hands-on. But that's some 40 years ago already. And Bibeau, who came in, sat on the board of something that might have been or could have been ag-related. And we all saw what a disaster she was. Now, Lawrence is getting a do-over coming back in for his second stint at this, and he's the one whose loose lips started talking about a mandatory 30% reduction in fertilizer use. I think he got out ahead of the comms team led by Katie Telford, of course, and he's actually spilled the beans, quite literally. And farmers are starting to be concerned. And what that does as a trading nation, it sends those ripples out across the world that Canadian agriculture is going to shrink, not grow, to feed that hungry world.
Well, they've already placed a 30% tariff on fertilizer from Russia, which is a large part of what farmers were getting their fertilizer from. So a 30% reduction. This to me smells of something that is just disastrous, catastrophic for farmers. Could this not only lead to Canada not being an exporter nation of foodstuffs, but in fact, could it lead to some degree of famine in this country?
Well, certainly. I mean, we eat on average about 50% of what we produce, some commodities higher than others, but then we export the balance. And if there isn't that amount to export, of course, we'll look after our own first. They'll come in with programs that say you have to sell cheap to the domestic supply, that two price system we used to have under the wheat board. But at the end of the day, I mean, it still comes down to our credibility and our capacity to be a global player. And we're losing that face out there on the world stage. Every time I see Trudeau or Jolie or Freeland or anybody go outside of Canada, I just shake in my boots, because every time they do, there's a major faux pas created.
And we mentioned Lawrence Macaulay. He does seem to have some roots in agriculture. As you said, 40, I didn't realize it was 40 years ago, though. He ran a small dairy farm. He does seem to have a better cognizance of agriculture than, say, a Bebo, who had absolutely no clue what she was doing or what agriculture was all about when she was there. But Macaulay worries me, because I remember Macaulay when you were in the House, and he had fairly substantial uh, ministerial responsibilities. And he was pretty good in question period. He handled himself pretty well.
Well, he had
I've
one
watched.
issue. He had one issue that he brought up every spring, and that was ferry service to some island off of PEI. Other than that, Lawrence was quiet.
Yeah, but I've watched him lately in question period, which I try to do live just about every day if I'm not doing something else. And it's worrisome, because he reminds me of Joe Biden, because he doesn't seem to have a sense of what he's even talking. It's like he's being given a script every day,
Mhm.
because every time there's an ag question, he seems to reach for a piece of paper and start talking about forest fires. And I wish I had a clip of this, but he's done this repeatedly.
Yeah.
And he's reading from a prepared script about how climate change is responsible for all the forest fires we had last summer, which of course I believe is absolute nonsense. There's no correlation there. There's no correlation has been proven, certainly by the Liberals. They just put that out there as a given. And it certainly is not a given. It's not a fact.
No.
But Macaulay just seems to want to talk about forest fires. Do you think the environment minister has just taken on the ag department as an appendage now? Because he seems to be a spokesman for Gilbo.
Well, I think there's only two or three major players sitting around the cabinet table, and certainly the ag minister of the day under the Liberals is not one. We were very much noticed by Prime Minister Harper the amount that agriculture drove the Canadian economy, the third largest contributor to our GDP, the largest manufacturing sector. Now I guess it's going to be EV batteries that nobody's going to buy. But at the end of the day, these guys sitting around that cabinet table in Ottawa, including the hand-picked people they put into the ministries and so on, do not have a clue about what's happening out here on the actual ground.
So it does concern you that ag issues are not going to be seriously considered then.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you look at our trade corridors, we've got free trade agreements, and they keep talking about adding to and, changing the title to be progressive as opposed to just free trade agreements. I mean, that's what they're all about is virtue, and there's no value in what they're talking about.
Yeah. I'm also concerned about, Trudeau's crackpot scheme to somehow magically lower grocery prices. And all he has said is
Yeah.
just do it, make it happen. And when he first said that, my mind went back to his father's wage and price controls of 1974, an issue he actually flip-flopped on. He ran in the 74 election against Bob Stanfield, the progressive conservative leader at the time, saying he would never institute wage and price controls. And famously or infamously, upon winning re-election, he was in a minority position. He went to a huge majority. He immediately instituted wage and price controls, and they were catastrophic, as they were everywhere.
Yeah.
But Trudeau doesn't even seem to have that much of a plan. He's telling grocery stores, okay, go back to the drawing board and come up with a plan for me that is going to lower grocery store prices. Now, my concern, first of all, is that when you artificially lower prices like that, you end up with scarcity in the grocery stores. We already saw that during COVID. I don't know how many times I walked into a local grocery store or Walmart and the shelves were empty. I think we could see that times 100 if we start artificially lowering the grocery store prices. We could have another Venezuela here. But what concerns me even more than that is the grocery stores, if they're forced to reduce their profit levels, they'll pass that on to the farmers. And they'll say, okay, can't afford to pay you that anymore. We're going to cut the price in half. Do you think that could happen?
Oh, absolutely. As I said earlier on, we import 50% of what we consume. And do you think he's going to put price controls in on all the countries we import from? He can't. It's not unlike his single-use plastics orders. As soon as that actually comes into play, then, everything that comes in from California and Florida and so on that comes in a plastic bag can't come in anymore. So all of a sudden, we're going to have less product on the shelves because the Americans are not going to change their way of doing things for one little country that's a minor part of their market share. So it's going to shrink. There's no doubt about it. Our shelves are going to be empty and the prices have to go up because the overhead costs of those stores, all that handling, all that transportation is still there. In fact, it's gone up because there's carbon tax and regulations at every level that add to that final price.
So this is really a vicious cycle for farmers.
Yeah.
They're going to be
But the downward
producing less with less fertilizer and getting less money for the crop they produce.
With higher inputs.
With higher inputs, exactly. I just want to refer to a slide here from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, where it actually says that farmers, that the price of doing business, put it in those terms, for farmers has increased by 21% in 2022, and that's the largest increase since 1974. I mean, how is that possible to sustain?
Well, it's not. And then you add on top of that all of the equipment and repairs, and a lot of the inputs come from offshore. And with a 72-cent Canadian dollar, farmers are paying that dollar value and eating the difference. It's astronomical, the extra that's being applied. Then you start looking at the downloading that's going on from the feds to the provinces to the municipalities or counties, and you start to realize farmers are captive on their ground. And I know that the feds are eyeballing the asset value out there in land. It's gone up exponentially over the last 10 or 15 years, especially in Western Canada when we've had the right to market our own products. And, they're looking at that and saying, hey, how do we scoop that?
Yeah. Well, and of course, the carbon tax is a huge factor in the cost of living for farmers. And as much as the Trudeau government likes to pretend it's not a factor, anybody with a little common sense, I think, can fathom that, yeah, it's a huge factor. Now, there's Bill C-234 in front of the Senate, I think today, at least this week. It's been in the news, not as much as it should be, because originally this bill was supposed to exempt all farmers, from the carbon tax. It's gone through committee. It's been gagged and distorted, strangled, and completely remade. So now, basically, it's not all farmers. It's pot growers. Pot growers get the exemption, and virtually nobody else. What is going on with this? Why is the Trudeau government insisting? And apparently, do you think he's working with the Senate? Is the Trudeau government working with the Senate to try to get this bill passed as the committee refocused it?
Well, how can that be? All those senators are independent. I'm sure they think for themselves until they get that envelope in the morning saying, do this. What I can understand is agriculture in Canada is literally the goose that lays the golden egg. As I said, the third largest contributor to our GDP. A lot of the stability that we've seen through these tough economic times, and we haven't hit bottom yet. That's coming in 2024. Even TIFF is starting to realize that at the Bank of Canada. So it's agriculture that is going to be the stable force that's going to hold us and bring us through this. But we're seeing them being eroded and chipped away at by an unknowing, uncaring federal government in Ottawa with the help of Jaggy and his little band, the Merry NDP. At the end of the day, no farmer can continue to take this type of onslaught and survive. And that's all going to affect everybody. I mean, we all like to eat several times a day.
Well, mentioning Jagmeet and his merry band of socialists, surprising to some degree that the NDP supported the Conservative motion yesterday to exempt all home heating fuel, including propane and natural gas, from the carbon tax for this 3-year pause, which is, of course, not a solution, but it might be a temporary Band-Aid for a lot of people. Does it worry you, though, that Trudeau has apparently concocted a deal with the separatist bloc to make this to over?
Well,
I mean, it didn't have any meaning if it had a past, but it was certainly symbolic. Does that worry you? He's aligned himself with separatists.
Well, I think there's two things there. Of course, it worries me that the Quebec tail can wag the rest of Canada's dog. I mean, we've always faced that. At the end of the day, they're the wild card, and Trudeau will play that every chance he gets. But I really think Jag was driven by the provincial arms of his party. He's the leader of everything, provincially as well. And there were a lot of provincial NDP governments and provincial NDP oppositions that were speaking out in support of the conservative motion. So he was trapped between a rock and a hard place, and he decided to go with the hard place. But he'll be there right away back in Trudeau's corner, whatever happens today. So it was a temporary lull. I think the premiers, they stood together in Halifax the same day the vote came down and said, we all agree this carbon tax is killing our economies. And, I didn't see that covered in a big way in any media operation. So it's been a while since the premiers have stood up to a federal leader. I think the last one was also named Trudeau.
I was just about to say that because you led us right into the next slide, which of course, the premiers are united on this issue, and
Yeah.
as you said, the last prime minister to get the premiers this angry and this focused and this united was Pierre Trudeau, and it really amazes me how much of the elder Trudeau's experience the younger Trudeau is going through, from this sort of experience with uniting premiers to inflationary times, to high interest rates, to invoking the Emergencies Act. It's scary at times how much his time as prime minister has mirrored the worst moments of his father. But this certainly is significant. The premiers are united on this issue, and I think this could well be a real crisis for Trudeau because the dominoes are falling. Once he admitted that you can take the carbon tax off for 3 years, apparently, and there won't be a catastrophe.
Can you
I
imagine
think he
the
admitted
forest fires?
it's a farce.
Can you imagine the forest fires in Atlantic Canada next year now? Unbelievable. Yeah.
Well,
Oh,
go
In
ahead.
truth, David, the old adage, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, applies here. We just have a carbon tax on that apple now. Other than that, Mini-Me Trudeau is doing exactly what his father did. He's leading this country into a socialist, almost fascist state, if I dare go that far. He's become a tyrant. He's answerable to no one. He knows it. He's getting a free ride by his paid-for media, and that's what's kept him alive. He's actually got absolutely zero status on the world stage unless he's handing out checks anymore.
Yeah, and God forbid he should go on the world stage because we know what happens. He goes to India, makes an absolute ass of himself, makes ridiculous accusations, or he goes to the WEF and makes promises, and God help us if he does fulfill. But it's interesting to me that Canada produces 1.4 to 1.8% of global gas emissions.
That's around there.
And that's virtually nothing in terms of our global carbon footprint. But this government continues to pretend that even if Canadians freeze, don't have any fuel, can't drive, can't fly, it's somehow going to fight climate change. And of course, even if our global gas emissions were reduced to 0%, it would have no impact on the world stage.
Well, it would actually have a negative impact because we would no longer be the carbon sequestration capital of the world. The way we grow our crops, the amount of forested land that we have, we are sequestering carbon, unbelievable amounts of carbon every day, and we get no credit for that. So that's what a government that's thinking without their head up their ass would come to realize and start to promote that, not hide it.
Yeah. I just want to play a brief clip here from your premier in Saskatchewan, Scott Moe, who I have a lot of time for. I think he's doing an excellent job. I just want your comment on this.
You said that if the federal government doesn't bend on carve-outs for natural gas or other heating sources, basically beyond heating oil, that you and your government as of January will stop collecting it. I just want to play for you the federal finance minister's response late last week to that threat, and then I'll get your reaction to it. Let's have a listen to Minister Freeland.
It is entirely appropriate, and I think an expectation shared by all Canadians, that everyone in the country should follow the law. That's our expectation, and it's our job to ensure that the law is enforced. It will be.
Premier, does the minister have a point? Does doing something illegal here really solve anything?
I would say that we're going to follow the law. Very shortly, there's going to be a law in Saskatchewan that will state that we won't be submitting the carbon tax on how we heat our homes with natural gas to the federal government. And I would say we're also following the law of thermodynamics, is heat pumps simply don't work in the climate across the prairie provinces. And so there are multiple laws in this space. Very shortly, there will be another law in place in Saskatchewan, and that's the law that we are going to follow.
But with all due respect, I take your point on the piece of legislation that you're going to pass, but there is a way in which this country works, right? That you collect a tax on behalf of the federal government, or vice versa, that the federal government collects some of their taxes on behalf of the provincial government. I mean, is this the most responsible thing to do, to start off on, and I get your concerns, I certainly just put them to the federal minister, but to start off on this foot where, you know, what kind of slippery slope are we starting here?
Well, I would say we're making exactly the same decision as the federal government did. The federal government made the decision to hold the carbon tax payments for heating fuel, which impacts largely Atlantic Canada. What we're saying is we're going to make a similar decision that is going to have an impact on Saskatchewan residents. I don't think anybody can agree with the most recent carve-out that the federal government is applying their carbon taxation policy fair. Most certainly it's not fair to all Canadian families.
Your comment, does this guy have guts or what?
Well, he's being pushed into that corner. There's a new movement in Saskatchewan that's bringing him back on track, and he's starting to find his conservative roots, and that's a good thing. But at the end of the day, the federal government can and will pass any legislation that creates a law, and they have the right to do that. Supreme Court rulings have set that that precedent. But at the end of the day, it's agreements between a federal government and a provincial government as to what will be collected. And you do not have to honor up. There's no law that says you are forced to collect their tax. It's an agreement where you get a certain amount, you know, to do that handling. And what Mr. Moe is saying is he's just not going to collect it. You can apply that tax, but you got to come and collect it yourself. So he's not saying the tax can't be applied in Saskatchewan. He's just saying he won't do it.
Which I think is certainly a great beginning, because he might be starting something here that is going to be very significant. But he mentions heat pumps as well in this.
Yeah.
And I find this fascinating, because when I first saw Trudeau talk about free heat pumps, I said, free for whom? Well, nothing, of course, is free.
Sure.
And especially our healthcare is not free either. But the fact that he's talking about free heat pumps for people below the poverty line. So if you're below the poverty line, I don't think you're probably going to be wanting a heat pump because you don't own a home.
Well, yeah.
So,
well, the point is there are some details that have been glossed over. It's a $600 assessment you have to have done to see that you even apply or could apply for one. It only applies to family incomes of less than $75,000. That's above the poverty line, and you have to have a home that's assessed at less than $300,000. So, you know, it's a pretty fine point on actually who's going to qualify for this at the end of the day to begin with. But then to say that these heat pumps are efficient is ridiculous. Anything below, you know, they're saying 20 degrees and so on. You know, I've been in places where they've had them and it's 10 degrees and they can't keep up. But at the end of the day, they're just not that effective. You still need a backup heat source. And what will that be? You know, you got to have a wood fireplace or you know, a stove or something like that, or keep your old oil furnace and run the heat pump as well. The problem that they have is the same thing as trying to charge all these EVs, is they do not have the electrical grid or the capacity, especially in Atlantic Canada, to do this. They're power poor. So where is that energy going to come from to run all of these?
well, that's an excellent point. In addition, of course, the Trudeau government's not even admitting these are not carbon neutral. They're not talking about the fact they have to plug them in. And this is just the usual.
You have to make them first.
You know, and yes, you have to make them, but you have to have a power source, and that's nothing is being discussed in the Liberal government from that standpoint. It's just like there's a magic power source for these things. They're going to make magic heat for you, and
They run on
plug them in.
unicorn parts. Yeah.
And it's the same thing when I hear people talk about electric cars being this panacea. Well, you have to plug those in too. They have to come from a power source. And of course, the batteries, we're never going to have enough of them, and we won't be able to replace them. And that is another catastrophic end for this, and it strikes me as a cruel joke, though, that you would tell people in Edmonton or Saskatoon or places where it goes to -30 and some -40 at times, that a heat pump is going to help you in the winter. Well, I think you're going to be very cold, because the research I've done indicates they really don't work under -15, -16 degrees Celsius. And the cost of these things is absolutely enormous. But we saw that clip of Freeland, of course, saying that we expect Saskatchewan to abide by the law. Thank you very much. I've noticed in the question period lately, Jonathan Wilkinson, who is the Minister of Natural Resources, could have been Chrystia Freeland's half-brother. They both have the same condescending attitude towards everybody in the House, and they both tend to shake their hand at me like this. And it amazes me how they continue to read from a script that is so divorced from reality, that is so far from everybody else's real truth, and they just are oblivious to it. And do you see any hope of ending this regime in the next 2 years with a parliamentary vote of any kind?
Well, not with Jagmeet bought and paid for and the Bloc standing by as a default mechanism. I don't. I think there's going to be a lot more pressure on Trudeau to remove himself. He's not going to do that. He hasn't even got to fly in his new airplanes that he's ordered. So he's going to hang around for a while. I mean, there's talk of him taking another big fancy Christmas vacation and making his decision at that time. I just don't see it, unless he's offered a big spot at the UN or something that he can go in and continue to spend money that isn't his. So I think we're stuck with this clown and the clown car full of the other clowns for as long as they decide they want to run.
I would concur, because I see people every week saying it's over for Justin Trudeau because some senator or one of his caucus members decides to criticize him. But
we all saw Ken McDonald from Newfoundland, who stood up, spoke out against the carbon tax, and when he's up voting in favor of the fiasco that they just put on Atlantic Canada, he gives a finger to the opposition. I mean, there you go. He's just a Liberal. He'll be in cabinet in no time.
Well, I thought the same thing, because yes, he voted twice in favor of Conservative motions to axe the carbon tax. Yesterday, he rejected that proposal, but of course, he's taken care of. And when he first came forth and started doing interviews about why he supported the last carbon tax motion by the Conservatives, I said at the time, this is everything to do with Kent getting re-elected and getting Atlantic MPs re-elected, because he didn't say we have to get rid of this tax in the long term because it doesn't make any sense. It is a punitive tax. It punishes people for doing things they have to do. He just said, let's put a pause on it for a couple of years, meaning until the next election, and I can get reelected and we can just do as we please again. So this is all cynical.
It's going to be interesting to see whether the carbon tax rebates continue to flow to Atlantic Canada, because there's a lot of issues they're still paying carbon tax on, barring the heat for their homes. So, any businesses, any fuel you buy, any groceries you buy, everything you touch has got a carbon tax on many, many levels in it. So will they continue to get the carbon tax rebate while they've got that carbon tax carve out on their home heating?
Yes, and a lot of folks are suggesting today that Quebec is backing Trudeau's carbon tax and conceivably the government for the next 2 years, because Quebec, of course, has a cap and trade program in place, and they really don't need their exemption.
Well, that's smoke and mirrors. That's like using monopoly money to change up into Canadian dollars. They're worth about the same right now. But at the end of the day, their cap and trade system, no one's continuing on with that. Ontario had one for a little while. California was the one that started it. And even they're realizing now that there's nothing left to trade. They capped everything, and they're in trouble. I mean, industry is moving out of California as fast as they can get a U-Haul. So, it's going to backfire at some point on Quebec. The biggest thing that Quebec's got going for them is they don't include their electricity production in the equalization formula. So that means they continue to get the lion's share of the money, most of it coming from Western Canada, Saskatchewan and Alberta. Ontario's on a pause economically as they try to struggle back from whatever fiscal policies they're working with at the time. And it's just unconscionable to people in Western Canada the amount of money that goes into Quebec to create the utopia that they can't afford without our dollars.
Yes, and yet they continue to talk about an independent Quebec, which would not be getting those dollars. And
They go broke in 3 years. Yeah,
it is an illusion, and it's unfortunately part of the daily narrative that comes out of Ottawa. This somehow this can continue without any repercussions. Do you think, though, is the carbon tax destined to fail before the Liberals are out in 2 years?
I'd like to say it would. I'm anxious to see how stalwart Premier Moe is, and whoever else he can get to stand with him to push back on the feds at all levels. I mean, if you're going to rip that Band-Aid off, you might as well take all the carbon tax. You're not going to collect any of it in the province of record, whatever that province would be. I think that's the route that needs to be done. I mean, if you're going to drop the gauntlet, make sure it hits the ground hard.
Well, and that's it. I guess we can only hope. What drives me craziest with the Conservative Party right now is they continue to say he's not worth the cost, talking about Justin Trudeau, and that to me is a completely ineffective election slogan or anything else, because it's not just that Justin Trudeau is not worth the cost. Sometimes I wonder if a lot of them are worth the cost. Well, the fact is he's catastrophic for this country.
But you've got to expand that to Trudeau and crew, the whole clown car, not just the driver.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. But if it was just a matter of him not being worth the cost, I don't think we would be in the condition we are. I'm concerned not only about where we're going economically, but Trudeau continues to bring censorship down upon Canadians. He brings the latest bill that's coming in the fall or early winter is going to be the Online Safety Act, which is going to make disinformation, misinformation, and something called malinformation illegal. Now, whether or not that's going to be criminal or civil or whatever they decide, the point of this bill, because I've read what the study groups have told the Liberals to do with this, disinformation and the like will not be defined in this bill because it will be that much harder to enforce if they define it. So it will be up to this Liberal government to decide what disinformation is. This broadcast could be disinformation. The post-millennial Rebel News, the Daily Caller, anything that it's new media or is not mainstream media could be disinformation. And I think what the legacy media is not getting, because they're not covering this story at all, is that they could be deemed disinformation because they'll come for you eventually. And this Trudeau government is catastrophic for Canada. And I hope we can find a means, a democratic parliamentary means, to end this parliamentary session sooner rather than later. Because I think for the sake of this country and for the soul of this country, I think a change is needed.
Well, the world is watching. I mean, he's a joke on the global stage. They're all starting to point fingers as to what's happening in Canada. Case in point, the Israel-Palestine conflict going on and how we're handling that as compared to other countries around the world. We're having the same results in our streets and so on. And our cops are standing by waiting to see what they should do. Now you compare that to what happened with the convoy in Ottawa, and you start to realize we've got a two-tier justice system at best. Both tiers are politically driven, and everybody's just wringing their hands and saying, what can we do? What can we do? We've got 4 gentlemen in Alberta, the Coots 4, they call them, that were part of that blockade at the Coots border. Now, there wasn't a blockade. I mean, there was traffic still moving through. But at the end of the day, they've now spent more time in incarceration without bail than our 2 Michaels did in China. And we're a democracy? Where that's
so true, Gerry. And I've been covering the Freedom Trial convoy here in Ottawa on a daily basis. It's been recessed for 3 years with Tamara Leach and Chris Barber.
3
And of
weeks.
course, you watch that and you say, what is the defense up to? Because they provide no evidence at all for the allegations, for the charges, and everything they provide reinforces what Tamara Leach and Chris Barber have been saying all along.
Yep.
Is that we told people to protest peacefully. We told them to cooperate with the police. We
And they
told
did.
them not to disturb residents.
Yeah. Well, you look at the graffiti that went onto a CBC studio in Montreal. None of that happened in downtown Ottawa. In fact, there's more businesses speaking up and saying it was great to have the crowd there. I know the Tim Hortons owner on Bank said they'd come in and mop the floors because they knew they were the ones that tracked in the dirt. So, I mean, these guys left a tremendous impression for the vast majority of people. Now, Paul Champ, the lawyer that's trying to put together this huge lawsuit, $300 and some million, his main witness, that government employee that was complaining about the noise and so on, she lives blocks away and probably couldn't even hear it. But that doesn't enter into any of the things on the stand at this point. But at the end of the day, I mean, we all see this for what it is. Trudeau was scared spitless of all the Canadians that lined up as that convoy went through, all the Canadians that came to visit in Ottawa to be a part of that. That's what scares him.
Yes, I think so. And I wrote the other day in the Epic Times that the Tamara Leach Chris Barber trial might not be technically a show trial in the Soviet Union sense, in the Stalinist sense, but it certainly is a show trial because they're trying to bankrupt these people and they're
Yep.
trying to make anybody who wants to protest think twice about protesting. And I think that is why this is a show trial. It's to put a chill into protests in this country. So if you want to oppose the Trudeau government, you want to oppose liberal policies, watch out. You're going to have your life upended, and you're going to have to go through a lot of legal and judicial problems.
Yeah. Well, he stacked the courts. We saw, 5 relatives of Dominic LeBlanc that have been named as judges. I mean, these guys are just so overt in the way they're putting together their own show. It's going to take a long time to wind it down. I feel for Pierre Poilievre when he finally gets into power, and he will, at some point it's going to happen, but trying to rebuild a federal civil service and so on, right through to the grassroots that have been so politicized and scared to think for themselves. They spent $700,000 hiring consultants to tell them how to get away from hiring consultants. I mean, it's just insult to injury day after day with these clowns. They're using your dollars to reinforce their own ideology. And that is no longer a democracy, folks.
Well, it might not be a technically Soviet-style show trial, but I hope we don't have a Soviet-style famine in this country as a result of these catastrophic agriculture policies. And Gerry, I want to thank you for joining me today. We miss you in Ottawa, believe me, and we miss the Harper government because there was a sense of somebody being in control, leading the way with a hand on the ship. Right now, there's a sense that nobody is in control, that there's a group of insiders telling Justin Trudeau what to do because he doesn't seem to have a grip on himself, on his caucus, on his cabinet, and certainly not on the government. So we miss you, Gerry.
Well, thank you so much for that. My days in Ottawa were fact-filled. Third-party people coming in to see. We had roundtables that gave me advice on every industry group that moved in the country. All of that's been lost. That's unfortunate because that's where your strength is at the grassroots.
That's very, very true. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Gerry. This has been a pleasure talking to you. And like I say, thank you for your years of service as a member of Parliament and as the Minister of Agriculture. You have been sorely missed. I think farmers would say the same thing. So let's do it again at your convenience. And let's hope and pray for this country because Justin Trudeau has never been good news.
Well said, David. Thank you for your time today. I look forward to the next steps.
Okay, bye for now. Thank you for watching another episode of Stand on Guard.